So grief, in a way, is this. Our lives are built by the stories we tell of all of our experiences. And a death loss or some other catastrophic loss, devastating loss, it could be a catastrophic injury, a terminal diagnosis, it could be the death of a dream, it could be immigration or migration, it could be the lack of safety that results from trauma. Any of those losses is akin to the manuscript of our lives being torn to shreds and then handed back to us with no instructions on how to rewrite or to live into our lives. And grieving is the experience of rewriting and living into the story of our lives, which means a lot of things we're going to talk about today, including, by the way, grieving is learning, which is why grief has so many cascading effects that we don't often talk about. And as I mentioned, you think about that shredded manuscript story, and then you think about our current story, which is it happens only with death, and you piece it back together and voila. So where did our collective grief story come from? And I want to name this, I'll probably say it several times. When I talk about the stupid things people or harmful things people say to us in our grief, or when I talk about the cultural stories that come from these places, there isn't necessarily malice I'm assigning to it, but there are real reasons. There are real reasons why these things are happening and why they're so pervasive and why we struggle so much to create a more grief literate world, which is exactly what I'm trying to do. Grief comes from our family, as those questions alluded to. Those are some of the first places we learn about what grief is and isn't. We learn more broadly from our culture. That can include things like media, the way grief is portrayed or not. It's often the absence of grief stories that is more problematic than the harmful portrayal. Sometimes the harmful portrayal is you become a widow and you just wait for George Clooney to come along and sweep you off your feet, and then you're happy and everything's great ever after. And as I always say when I give this talk, if Amal decides to leave George and he wants to come sweep me off my feet, I'm there for it. But it's often the absence of stories. It's the grief we don't show in different populations, the grief expressions that we don't show. Certain religions have different stories or prescriptions or perspectives that can sometimes limit our ability to be with our grief. One example is the sort of idea that they're in a better place now. And I'm not negating the value of religion for people, but if that is the tenet by which people are talking to you, then it removes your agency to be sad, that there's something wrong with me if I'm sad now, that I don't have, that I'm not connecting with this. So we have to be careful about the words we use when we're talking to grievers. I think in a lot of ways, our systems are some of the biggest culprits, both in enacting the stories, the harmful stories we have about grief, but also continuing them. So when we think about policies and laws and systems, then we recognize that that very narrow singular story of grief is perpetuated. We live, for instance, in a capitalist system that requires hyper-productivity and for you to have your well-being tied up in your job, your health care, your food costs, how you live. So the story that grief is something that you move through in a neat and orderly fashion very quickly supports a system like capitalism, right? We know that grief culture is impacted by our systems because of the laws, or more likely the laws we don't have on bereavement leave. So even though nobody said to you, your grief doesn't matter, if you lost somebody like a sister or a friend who you will not be covered for your bereavement leave if you're lucky to work somewhere where there is a bereavement leave, the message to you is that loss doesn't matter as much. I could give a whole talk on this, but I'm going to move on. But I just hope you can start to see that there's these sources that come up, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, that both tell us a story, but then also reinforce a harmful story. And all of these stories are in conflict with what we innately, inherently are feeling in our grief. And instead of challenging the story or the systems, we end up questioning ourselves. I know I did that when I had to return to work after 2 weeks and wasn't on the top of my game. I literally remember saying, what's wrong with me? I mean, now it's so absurd, right? But we end up questioning ourselves. So a lot of the work that I do is kind of pushing back at systems. I go into workplaces and help them expand a more generous bereavement policy, but also just creating better grief culture. So now we know this is the soup we're swimming in. You don't swim in soup. This is the soup we're marinating in, the water that we're swimming in, which is why it's so hard for many of us individually to push back and really show up genuinely for our grief.